My guest today is David Bedford. David's a Beatle historian and the author of several books about the Beatles. He spent 20 years researching, interviewing, and writing about the Beatles. He's the associate producer of the documentary film Looking for Lennon, which was nominated for a National Film Award. He also hosts his own podcast about the Beatles and Liverpool, Liddypod. Welcome, David. Thanks for being on my show.
Oh, the absolute pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Hey, real quick, before we get started, a few years ago, I had the opportunity to spend a week with Donovan.
Okay.
He took me under his wing as a student, a guitar student, and he taught me some guitar chords and the claw hammer, which is the famous finger-picking pattern that he claims this guy, Dirty Hugh, taught him. And when he says he was taught it by Dirty Hugh, Hugh said, you have to pass it on now, like I passed it on to you. So Donovan actually claims he taught John Lennon, which is that classic, rootsy, melodramatic finger-picking patterns. He also told me about roots. He was big on the word roots music.
Yeah.
How, look, you'll probably go into today how it influenced the Beatles, and some people think, oh, black people in America, blues, but actually it came from your side of the pond first, right? Roots music before, like the Native Americans were not doing roots and blues music. So I'm looking forward to you filling in the gaps in the history and telling us some facts about the Beatles that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, happy to. Ask away. I'm happy to answer anything.
You live in Liverpool, and you grew up in Liverpool.
Yep.
And you say the Beatles couldn't have come from any other town than Liverpool. So tell me about that. Why is Liverpool so fantastic?
Yeah, it's it's a unique place because officially we've been around since 1207, so over 800 years old.
Oh, wow.
And we became one of the most important commercial ports in the world. And at the time of the British Empire, at times we were more important than London was, even though geographically and from population we're smaller. But we had this massive influx, particularly of the Irish in the 1840s when there was the Great Famine in Ireland. So 1.5 million Irish people passed through Liverpool in 10 years. Now, majority of them went over to the East Coast of America, particularly to New York and Boston. So people like, even trace back to John F. Kennedy, his family left Ireland, came through Liverpool and headed off to America. So it was a major port of destination.
I see.
But as it's quite usual for a port like that, there's a proportion of people always stay. So we've had this huge population of this real mixture of different nationalities and influences. So we've got the oldest Chinese community in Europe set up here, huge Irish, Scottish, and Welsh communities, big Italian, German, Scandinavian, and then also a big Afro-Caribbean community as well. And each one of these nationalities is bringing something different into Liverpool. So different cultures, different music, all these different influences. What becomes important for when we're looking at the growth of what you're saying, with roots music, is that Liverpool, by the time you get to the 1950s and 60s, has the biggest country and western scene in Europe.
Oh, yeah, that's another thing I didn't realize. I mean, it should, right? Because country is roots music. And by the way, in America, country music these days, it's called trap country because it's like rap country. And I'm like, they don't even really own that word country because their music they're just going with the flow, and they never really own the word country because, like you're pointing out, that music came from somewhere else. Everything's roots music, the Beatles and every kind of starts with.
So that original, roots music, which is at the heart of skiffle music. So John Lennon's first group, the Quarrymen, a lot of that, the roots are in what we'd refer to as country music, certainly in roots music as well. And therefore, the roots of the Beatles are there. So the country music that comes down from the Appalachian Mountains in sort of the 1910s, 1920s, the origins of those are in British folk music, and particularly the Ulster Scots, who were this hybrid communities in what is now Northern Ireland and in Scotland, and they were living that northern part of Ireland, went over to the States, to the Appalachians. That music comes down and eventually becomes country music. But all those roots are actually in British music.
Was it called country music in Britain? Or was called the other word you used?
Well, a lot of it really is British folk music.
Okay.
So a lot of it is considered folk. That goes over, then you've got the varieties then. I mean, because country has got so many genres within it, it's hard to find what country music is.
I wonder if Garth Brooks considers himself British country music. That's where he originated from.
Yeah, but that's it. So the roots of that are in Britain, which has gone over to the States. Country becomes big and comes back over here. And so the heart of what the Beatles were learning starts with country music. So in particular, Hank Williams. Now, the number of different Merseybeat musicians I've spoken to over the years who will cite Hank Williams as a major influence before Elvis, Buddy Holly, etc. Hank Williams was there first. So John Lennon, for example, was a big Hank Williams fan. And if you listen to Hank Williams, you can hear the beginnings of rock and roll.
Oh.
And particularly, there was a song that he had called Move It On Over. The melody from Move It On Over is lifted and changed slightly, and it becomes Rock Around the Clock.
Oh.
And of course, that's one of the first big rock and roll songs. But that actually comes from a country song.
And so what else was so special about, was there no place else in Britain that had such a melting pot of country music that you don't think the Beatles would have had the same influence with the country music if they hadn't been in Liverpool?
I think that the country music, any of the port cities, the major ports like Bristol, London, maybe Glasgow and Newcastle. But what Liverpool had, which made it quite unique, is two things. One, the first transatlantic passenger crossings went between Liverpool and New York. That was about 1840. So there's been this regular transatlantic crossing between Liverpool and New York and Boston as well. And so there's the sailors who were sailing on the White Star and the Cunard shipping lines. They'd sail over to New York and then they'd get off and they'd have 3 or 4 days in New York and then do the return journey. So when they're in New York, they're buying American suits, cameras, but particularly records. So they were then bringing those records back to Liverpool.
Oh.
And everybody knew somebody on the ships.
I see.
And so Liverpool musicians were getting access to records which hadn't been released in the UK yet.
For today's crowd, you almost have to tell them, even it hasn't been that long ago, there were no cell phones and digital music and MP3s, that you had to buy an album and had to be in the store, and there was distribution. If it wasn't in your town, in your record store, and it wasn't on the radio, you couldn't hear the music. That's
exactly that. Yeah, I want problems with.
Yeah. So Liverpool being a hub for stuff coming back from country music in America. Okay, that makes sense.
But it wasn't just country. It was jazz, right. It was R&B, and then it was rock and roll and blues. So all of that was coming in. Got this real mixture. But then, again, something that was quite unique, just outside Liverpool was an airbase called Burton Wood. And the US Air Force took that over in 1942. And it became the biggest operational airbase in Europe during the Second World War. Now, there was a presence there until, I think, the late 1980s, but certainly around the late 50s, early 60s, there was about up to 20,000 US service personnel on that base. Now, they were segregated on the base like it was back in the US. So when they had their downtime, those guys would come into Liverpool. And so we had a large black population in an area called Liverpool 8. So the black US servicemen would go to all the clubs in the black area of Liverpool 8. And the white guys would go into the city centre. So you've got Americans bringing their American records to these clubs. And you've got John Lennon and Paul McCartney being introduced to all these Americans and local black musicians as well by a character called Lord Woodbine, who ends up in 1960 co-managing the Beatles with Alan Williams. So they were meeting not only local black musicians who were teaching them different chords, different rhythms, but they were meeting American servicemen carrying their records with them. And they're hearing about artists and songs which they wouldn't find anywhere else.
Mm.
So again, it's very, very unique combination of all these different bits and bobs, these different influences. And it's interesting, you mentioned radio. So in the UK back then, there was only one radio station, that was the BBC. That was a national radio station.
It keeps it simple. You're either on the radio or you're not. You only have one station to go to.
Yeah, exactly. And you wouldn't get rock and roll on there.
Oh.
And when skiffle was a bit of a craze for a couple of years, 56 to sort of beginning 59, they would have a young person's skiffle radio show on there. But you wouldn't really be hearing rock and roll. So to hear the music, you had to tune into Luxembourg. So this little principality in the center of Europe, Luxembourg, was beaming in radio shows into the UK. That's where you could hear American DJs and the latest American music.
Was that kind of like pirate radio in California and Hollywood here in the 80s or 90s, like a rebel rock station, rebel station? Or?
Oh no, this one we did get those in the 60s, and Radio Caroline was the most famous of them, the pirate radio station just off the coast of Britain. But this was Radio Luxembourg, because it was set up in Luxembourg. They were broadcasting from the 1930s. So by the time rock and roll's come in, they're beaming the shows in. So everybody would tune in to Radio Luxembourg. And it was hard to get the frequency on shortwave. So the signal, you'd always be tuning the knob just to try and get it right.
Yeah.
But that's how you heard the latest songs that were in the US charts.
So Paul and John sounds like they're first. They get together first. And they're listening to all this music. And they're writing songs together. How does the Beatles come to be formed? The rest of the members, where do they come from? How does it evolve from just listening to some records that come over from New York and the servicemen into the Beatles?
Well, the most important person is Lonnie Donegan. Now, George Harrison said, "No Lonnie Donegan, no Beatles." Now, Lonnie Donegan was... Yeah, he was a jazz musician playing in the Chris Barber jazz group. And what they would do is, because they were playing Dixieland jazz, which is all instruments blaring away constantly, you could only play for about 45 minutes before your lips would go numb. So the band would have to take a break. So you wouldn't want to lose the audience. So what they would do is, Lonnie Donegan, who played banjo in the group, he would come forward with a guitar. Chris Barber, the band leader, had what's called a T-chest bass. Now, a T-chest bass is a wooden box with a broom handle, string on the top, and you just play the string. It's simple. Beryl Bryden, lady singer, she played a washboard with sewing thimbles. Basic stuff. All these songs Lonnie Donegan was picking up from the Library of Congress at the US Embassy in London. And these were some early roots music. Huddie Ledbetter, known as Lead Belly, he did a lot of the songs, as well as Woody Guthrie, obviously the American folk singer. And they were all... So the Chris Barber jazz group were making an album and they had 8 songs ready. They needed 2 more. And they said, why don't we throw on a couple of those skiffle songs that we do at the interval? So they put on Rock Island Line and John Henry. So then at the end of 1955, those 2 skiffle songs come out as a record. Rock Island Line is the A side, John Henry is the B side. By the end of January 56, that's in the top 10 in the UK charts. It also makes it into the top 10 in the US charts. And Donegan becomes this hero over here. He's going around and he's saying, right, learn yourself 3 chords, maybe even 4, and you can play all of these songs. And so right across the UK, all these guys, young lads like John Lennon, age 16, chatting with his friends and said, wouldn't that be fun to be able to play them?
We can learn 3
Make
chords.
our own instrument.
Sure.
And so they start the group. So all the biggest musicians really, and the big groups that come out in the 60s start in skiffle. And it's all because of Lonnie Donegan. So that's how John starts the Quarrymen in the summer of 1956. He bought Island Line.
There's this idea that after all the bands in America saw the Beatles do it, they're like, I can do that. When really the Beatles learned it from someone else. Oh, look at that guy. He plays 3 chords. We can do that. And of course, they probably did it better, but that's where they got their inspiration from.
Yeah. None of them would have got started as musicians if it wasn't for Lonnie Donegan. So John hears the record and buys it. Paul and George go and see Donegan in concert in Liverpool. And both say they want to do that. That's when Paul swaps his trumpet for a guitar. George gets a guitar. So sales of guitars in the UK go from 5,000 a year to 250,000 in a year. There are thousands of these skiffle groups starting up all over the country. And there's a lovely film clip, a talent show on television. And there's 2 15-year-old kids. And they do a skiffle song. And they get interviewed afterwards. And they say to one of the lads, do you want to be a professional musician? He says, no, I want to go into biological research. And his name was Jimmy Page.
Wow.
So at 15...
I didn't see that one coming.
No, exactly. Now, I say, to be fair, Led Zeppelin did a fair amount of biological research themselves.
They definitely, Page definitely borrowed from roots music, or he learned roots music, so it was built into him.
Yeah, they all did. So these big stars, I say that came out of the 60s, all started with skiffle, and all owe a debt of thanks to Lonnie Donegan.
Wow.
Because without him, we don't get the Beatles and all these other bands. It doesn't happen.
Nice. And from there, it's all history. Takes off, evolves. Wow.
Yeah.
So, are the Beatles still relevant? You say you have this question to ask you: are the Beatles still relevant? How are they still relevant? This story is inspiring. That's inspiring. How else are they still relevant?
Because thanks to the Beatles, singer-songwriters are still making records now. Because before them, there were no guitar-based groups who were certainly writing and recording their own music. But really, it was country music, which is seen as a smaller genre. Normally, if you wanted a career in music, if you were a good singer, you'd get signed, and then your record company would go and find a song for you to sing.
Country music.
And you'd make your record. If you wanted to be a musician, you had to learn the proper stuff of learning to read and write music. And you could become a session musician, like Jimmy Page, and all those others, these session musicians. What the Beatles became the first was they refused to be performing and recording other people's songs unless it was to, add on to an album. They wanted to write and record their own songs. And so suddenly, because George Martin backs them and lets them do that, it's almost opening up a whole new landscape to all these other bands that come through in the 60s whether you're talking about the Stones or the Who, etc., it was all saying you can now go and not only perform, but you can write and record your own music. And by doing that, everything else follows. So these days, if you're a band writing and recording your own music, you owe a debt of thanks to the Beatles because they changed absolutely everything in the music industry.
This was after they became more famous and powerful, though, right? When they started out, they were doing cover tunes.
Oh, yeah. Until they got the record deal. But when they make the first record, Love Me Do, George Martin wanted them to record another song called How Do You Do It, written by a songwriter called Mitch Murray. And they said, no, we have to do our own song. So Love Me Do becomes the first single.
What do you suppose gave him that idea? Like, all of a sudden, I'm good enough to, I mean, that's pretty, that's pretty confident. Were they that good as songwriters all of a sudden? I mean,
and they developed it. They developed it over the years because John and Paul have both been experimenting with songwriting since 1957.
Before they were introduced to the guitar, before he changed from trumpet to guitar, he was writing songs on the trumpet.
So for Paul, at the end of 56, get a guitar. John's already got one earlier in 56. So they both, by 1957, are starting to write some songs together. They meet in July 57. And one of the things they connect with is not just the musicians they like, the songs they like, but that they both sort of experimented with songwriting. And neither of them had met anybody else who was.
Oh, they wrote songs. Oh, yeah. I get that as a songwriter a lot. People, they're in cover bands and they're like, we only have 15 songs, cover songs. I'm like, why don't you write some of your own songs? It's shocking how many great musicians, excellent guitar players, they can't even write a single good song of their own. It has to be a good song. If it's a bad song, why bother? So Paul and John were clearly talented from the get-go. So that kind of helps. Backing up a little bit, when you mentioned the Library of Congress, what did you mean? Did they have to go there to get the sheet music, the lyrics, the copyrights? People today, we just go on the internet and, there's the lyric and there's a video on how to play it. So back then you had to go buy a physical album to hear it. By Library of Congress, you mean to actually get the words, or what was that about? The music so you could play it properly?
Yeah, so that was what Lonnie Donegan was doing in London. So he'd go into the US Embassy where they had part of the Library of Congress. He would borrow the records.
Oh, the records themselves were in there.
He was borrowing the records and learning the songs. So most of the songs that he did were American songs. So Rock Island Line is an American song. A lot of them were like railroad songs and American folk, etc., like that.
And people would have no idea where he was borrowing it from or getting his inspiration. They wouldn't be at the Library of Congress going, who would have thought? Who would have known, right? How did he know? He just knew.
It's because Donegan lived in London, and he was so fascinated with American music that he was told within the Library of Congress in the embassy in London, there are records that you can borrow.
Nice.
You go along it.
I've got two Beatles conspiracy theory questions to ask you. I'm sure you've heard them both, because if I've heard them, you've heard them. The first one is when supposedly Paul died. When the Beatles are together as a band, it's the album cover where they're walking across the sidewalk, I think, or something like that. Or
the zebra crossing. They're crossing at Abbey Road, yeah.
So theoretically, Paul died and they replaced him. I mean, maybe the idea is it's such a big band, they don't want to lose them. What are your thoughts about that? True or false? And why? How did that come to be in the first place? How do you dispel a myth like that?
Wow, it's hysterical, really. It's funny. And once the Beatles had heard about it and they thought how daft it was, they started to try and put things into either conversations or whatever to give more clues to something which was clearly nonsense.
Oh, it was a joke.
Oh yeah.
Or they took off with it. Like, we'll make fun of this kind of thing.
Oh, they embraced it and they thought, okay, well, have some fun with this because it's so stupid.
I see.
That we can have a lot of fun with this. And it's like with anything. If you've got a conspiracy theory and you want to find something, if you look hard enough, you will find a clue, which is never a clue.
So how did that one start? How did the one start?
It was a DJ who came up with the whole thing. And it just sort of, it just started to grow in popularity. And it's almost like it was started as a joke.
He said, Paul's dead. Like, this is not the real Paul just out of the blue somehow, accidentally. Okay. Yeah. And somebody believed it.
Yeah. And it's great because one thing, I've got a YouTube channel called Bright Moon Liverpool. And we have a lot of films on there, either stuff around Liverpool or interviews. And one of the ones that is still getting comments on is the Paul is dead thing. And it's quite funny. And you can see people are buying into having a laugh with it because they know it's nonsensical.
What's the biggest thing these people that believe it latch on to, as in, how do you explain that?
What they try and look for are clues in the videos saying that Paul's appearance had changed. And then, as you say, it's the Abbey Road cover is the big one of saying it's like a funeral procession.
Mm-hmm.
So you got John at the front dressed in all white, so he's leading the funeral procession. Paul's got no shoes on, which shows that he's dead. And then,
okay, I wouldn't have thought of that one. Somebody saw the symbology there.
Oh, it's crackers.
Not wearing shoes. That means
Volkswagen Beetle in the background, and the registration plate of the Volkswagen Beetle in the background. If you interpret it, it shows Paul's age at the time he died.
Yeah, but that could be the Beatles playing tricks on people.
Exactly.
So here's an even crazier one that you kind of hinted at with how their appearances look different on different photos. Have you heard the one, the Beatles never existed?
I mean, that comes up with the film Yesterday, didn't it?
I don't recall. It was just, as a musician, Googling, and somehow the Beatles pops up in my Google, and then somehow you get sucked into this, however the algorithm works. So when you're looking for stuff you don't know you're looking for, like, the website URL was still there, but they had taken down the content. And it basically said this, it basically ended with, we have better things to do with our life now. But we spent years on looking at different album covers, different pictures of the members of the Beatles, and there's no way it's possible that these are the same people in all the photos unless they've been cloned. Talking about the shapes of the ears, like if it was a cloning, there'd be these leftover remnants, whatever you call it, where you can't have a perfect clone. See, his nose is a little different, but everything else is the same. And you're like, well, how do you? What can you say back to that?
It's often saying they picked it up with the film Yesterday, which came out a few years ago, where this guy he's knocked down by a bus, and he remembers all the Beatles songs. But suddenly he goes on Google and the Beatles don't exist.
Oh, I saw that movie. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's brilliant fun. So he's claiming all these songs as his own.
Yeah. It's a good flick. Yeah.
And it was good fun to take that premise and run with it. It was a good film. But there's so much eyewitness testimony and photographs and stuff. Basically everything the Beatles did was recorded somewhere. So it's, I mean, the conspiracies they're just funny, but you can't take them seriously.
Sure. Well, what's the strangest stories you've uncovered about the Beatles? Non-conspiratory stories that are true stories.
The biggest area of controversy in the story of the Beatles is when Pete Best is dismissed and Ringo Starr replaces him.
Yeah.
And there's been so many different versions put out there. And it's just one that I've followed for so many years.
So for people who don't know the Beatles that well, let's frame this. The Beatles just became popular, right? And Pete is the drummer. or they're just on the verge of breaking huge, right? And now imagine you're the drummer of this band that's about to get world famous, and they say, sorry, we're going to replace you with another drummer. Basically, right? That's what happened. And the question where you're going with your story is, why? They didn't like him. He wasn't good enough drummer. That's where all the different.
There's been so much written about it, and I eventually worked out exactly what had happened and why, and kept it nice and simple. So Pete was the Beatles become a rock and roll group in May 1960. They go to Hamburg in August 1960, and Pete joins them as a drummer. So he's with them for 2 years. With Pete in the group, because they had Stuart Sutcliffe on bass originally as well. Hamburg is where they learn to be a really top band. They learn how to entertain. They learn their stagecraft. They learn everything really on the stages in Hamburg.
That's why you say it was so important, that town.
Exactly. So there they are. So by the end of 61, they're the best group in Liverpool, best in Hamburg. And that's when Brian Epstein then discovers them, becomes the manager. So with Pete, they get Brian as the manager. And without Brian, they never would have made it out of Liverpool. And then it's through Brian, they get to meet George Martin, who gives them an audition in June 1962 and eventually offers them a contract with Pete in the group. What happened was, at that audition in June 62, at the end of the session, George Martin says to Brian, says, I don't mind what happens, as a group. If I decide to give you the contract, I'm going to bring in a session drummer because your drummer can't do exactly what we want in the studio. Now, that was normal practice back then. It wasn't going to affect
session drummer for non-musicians who don't realize, actually, like my parents, they think, just play it like so-and-so. I'm like, they have a studio session player come in that plays the guitar and the drums and even backing vocals on your album because they can do it better. And that's what everybody does. People have no idea when you say session player, because you said it's pretty commonplace. It still is today.
Yeah.
If, all the big bands, like Taylor Swift, her band is all technically session players, right? She doesn't have a band. So Pete's in the band, but the producer wants to bring in a session player who is Ringo Starr, or it could be anybody at this point. They're just saying, we're going to bring in someone else to record on the album. Pete's not doing the drum sound we want. Right.
Yeah, that's it. So, so that was fair enough. The problem was, Brian, as manager, he sold records, but he wasn't in the recording industry. So he wouldn't have realized that was normal practice. He goes to John, Paul, and George and says, if we get the contract, the producer doesn't think Pete's good enough to play on the record.
He misinterpreted, like Brian did. He didn't understand. It's just
he didn't understand it.
We didn't have to replace Pete on tour just for recording. Got it.
Yeah. And so suddenly they think, okay, he's great playing live, but if the producer doesn't think he's good enough, we're going to have to get another drummer.
I see.
Right. So I interviewed Brian Epstein's lawyer, and he told me exactly what has happened, all the conversation with Brian. What I also then uncovered was there were 4 drummers who were asked. Ringo was the only one of the 4 who said yes. The myth has been built up that the Beatles wanted to get rid of Pete because he couldn't play drums and all these other excuses they come up with because they wanted Ringo in the group. That's not the truth. They had no problem with Pete until those comments from George Martin.
So why did no other drummer want to play on the album besides Ringo Starr? Because they weren't good enough yet? They weren't famous? Or because they were too famous and they didn't want to step on their toes?
It's a mixture. So the first guy they asked to join is called Bobby Graham. Now, Bobby was one of the top session drummers in the UK. But he was also playing with a top band, Joe Brown, the Brothers. They had the #1 hit single. They were on a national tour. So Brian approaches him. And of course, why is he going to turn down? Why is he going to accept an invitation to join a group he's never heard of?
This is like Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac's on tour, and they're not going to wait for Lindsey Buckingham because they want to go without him. Are you kidding me? When your band isn't touring, you just want to be on the road playing. That's what I do. And if you're playing with someone else, you can't say yes to that kind of thing. Like they weren't available because they had, the Beatles must have not been as big yet as.
Well, they weren't big at all.
Okay.
So Bobby's, he lives in London. He's got his family there. He's already one of the top session drummers in the country. He's playing with a band who's got #1 hit single, national tour.
Oh, sorry. Was this before they put out their first album?
Yeah.
Oh, so nobody knows who they are.
No, they've not even done the first single yet.
Okay.
So this is
they're a good live band, but nobody knows. But they're not huge at all yet. Okay.
No, nobody's ever heard them outside Liverpool.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, so he turns them down flat. They then draw up a list, and there's probably about a dozen drummers who were considered. The next guy they asked was Richie Galvin, a really good drummer with a local band called the TTs. He turns them down. He just got married, and like a lot of musicians in Liverpool, didn't like John Lennon.
All these guys, probably after the fact, when the first album came out, like, what were we thinking?
No, it had no regrets.
No?
He never regretted it.
Okay.
No. The third drummer asked was Ringo. He was asked on a Saturday night, introduced to Brian, offered the job. Brian telephoned him on the Tuesday. Pete was brought into the office on Wednesday, given the bad news, and Ringo makes his debut on the Saturday. Now, the big thing I discovered with talking to Brian's lawyer was that we've been told since 1962 that Brian Epstein fired Pete Best. And that's not the truth.
Pete Best is the drummer, right?
Pete Best was the drummer, but he was never fired.
Okay. Why did he leave?
He couldn't be fired because for Brian Epstein to fire Pete, he would have to have employed him. But he never employed him. The Beatles employed Brian. You can only sack an employee. Well, the Beatles didn't have someone who owned them. They owned themselves. So Brian couldn't sack him.
Technically, did Pete own 1/4 of the Beatles then? Who owned the Beatles' name? Who owned the Beatles, as a band?
The Beatles, they were a partnership.
It's a 4 partnership, so technically Pete's entitled to 1/4 unless they buy him out.
Yeah, because partners cannot sack a fellow partner.
So they bought him out?
To dissolve the partnership, which they didn't do, and they didn't have time to do it. So they tricked Pete into thinking he was being fired.
But even then, Pete would have some recourse, no?
Yeah.
And he
got the wrong legal advice.
Oh. Wow.
So his lawyer tries to sue Brian for wrongful dismissal. So Brian's lawyer says, my client did not employ your client. So we had to keep sending him away. So eventually when Pete joins another band, he quits the Beatles.
By default. So
by default, he's been tricked into it.
Even my friends who are in bands, and even a lot of good bands, they don't understand band contracts. So let's explain this to them. The last bands I've been into, I want them to sign a band contract, and they won't because they just think I'm being evil and they can't wrap their head around that. By default, we have a partnership.
Yes.
It's not like whether you sign the contract or not, we are now a group, an entity. And take the word the Beatles, for example, unless we agree on paper when we form the band and come up with a name, who owns it, we all own an equal share. By default, we don't have to sign anything.
Correct.
My bandmates, I can't get them when I'm in a band. I'm not in one now because this is how frustrating it is, right? And you're looking way down the road to, okay, we become big. Why else are we doing this? Who owns the name? I came up with the name, you came up with it, and if they came up with it, I actually kind of want it on, and maybe I don't want it on paper, but some people don't understand you're legally bound whether you want wanted to be an okay. So Pete was technically
Exactly.
he owned a quarter of the Beatles.
Yeah.
Straight up like a corporation. It's like buying stock in Apple when it was founded and not realizing that I owned it. I was tricked out of it.
Exactly. He was tricked out of it.
Yeah.
And by default.
Our bad lawyer. Yeah.
I actually uncovered the fact that the four Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Pete, did actually sign a partnership agreement at the end of 1961 as well.
With Ringo in it. Once Ringo was in it?
No. This was John, Paul, George, and Pete at the end of 1961, just after Brian has become their manager. They get a contract between the four of them as the Beatles.
So Brian probably made them do that because he was a lawyer.
So that was like the biggest thing. So then the night that Pete's given the bad news and he's kicked out, they've got no drummer. So the band who was supporting the Beatles that night are the big three. Their drummer, Johnny Hutchinson, is asked to step in and play with the Beatles that night, which he does. And he plays them and it goes really well. And after the gig, and remember this is the day after Ringo's been offered the job, Johnny Hutchinson is approached by Brian and is offered the job. Now he turns it down. And again, he had no regrets about turning it down. But he turns it down. But we don't know what does that make of the offer to Ringo. If Johnny Hutchinson can be offered the gig the day after Ringo's been offered it, was Ringo only offered it on a probationary period? Trial basis? That is possible. We don't know for sure.
They weren't sure. It's kind of like showing your apartment to different tenants. You're like, oh yeah, you're great, but I'm still gonna finish interviewing the rest of people maybe just to see. You know, talking about the contracts, when I was with Donovan, Linda brought up a story that she don't want, talk about a lot because it's kind of dark, but Brian Jones, one of the founders of the Rolling Stones, similar situation. They kind of want to get rid of Brian for whatever reason, but they're in this partnership and he dies in a swimming pool accident. He drowns, but yet he's a really good swimmer. The way I kind of heard the story through the grapevine was they went over to his house and with a knife, and they had they didn't have the best intentions when they went. No, did they kill him? No. Did somebody else did? Maybe, because after they went over, tried to reason with him, strong arm him as just as you might if you're in a band argument. That didn't work. Ended up laying in a swimming pool face down the next day, right? And he drowned, but he's a great swimmer. So some
contracts are interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest one I came across was with Don Felder and the Eagles. So
what's that one?
Eagles they got back together, going to go on tour again. And what's been agreed is that Don Henley and Glenn Frey, as the two main guys, as the songwriters within the Eagles, they're going to be on more money than the rest of the band.
I've heard that.
Don Felder, he didn't think that was fair.
Right.
And so he said, I'm not signing the contract. So Glenn Frey says to him, like, okay, you've got until like 6:00 tonight. You're either in or you're out. Felder won't sign the contract.
Which means basically he wouldn't be able to play with them on tour.
Yeah.
More or less. And of course you want to play if you're a musician. I mean, who wouldn't want to play with the Eagles? So that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, I'd probably sign even and just be angry. Like, why are you getting all the money and I'm just not getting anything, but I'm having fun, right?
But he was pig-headed to that and thought that's not fair.
Oh, he wouldn't.
And so, so he wouldn't sign it. So Irvin Azoff, their manager, takes Don Felder out and tells him he's fired from the group. But the same principle applies that Don Felder was a partner in the Eagles.
And this is just in the 2000s, right? This is only 15 years ago.
So it took them about 4 or 5 years to settle it. So Felder couldn't go on tour with them because he was out of the group. But as a partner in the Beatles, in the Eagles, they had to come up with an offer which met the percentage of the partnership that Don Felder had.
And meanwhile, they're on tour making money. They're doing the shows.
It cost them millions.
So he won in the end.
Yeah.
The pig-headed paid off.
So he got the money. He was out the band.
He just didn't get to have fun playing on stage.
Exactly. He had one of the greatest bands ever, and he's out. But he got a financial settlement because he was a partner in the group, just as Pete was a partner in the Beatles.
I have to think, what would I do? I mean,
exactly.
After the show's over, I could use some money. I don't want to work at McDonald's, but the show doesn't last long, in its work of going on tour and everything else. So, and he knew that because he was in the business. He had done it before, so that's a little different. He had done it. It's a lot of work. He probably didn't even want to go on tour. Come to think of it, he's been there. It's so much work, and it's just going.
He wanted to be there, and I think he regretted his decision. But it was exactly the same thing with the Eagles as with the Beatles. They tell their manager Irvin Azoff to go and fire him. He goes off, fires Don Felder, but he can't fire him because he doesn't employ him, and Felder is still a partner. So it's exactly the same thing. It's just that when Pete kicked out, they hadn't earned the money from the records yet. So there wouldn't have been a massive payout, but there still would have been a payout. But they avoided doing all that.
So what do you know about Donovan's connection to the Beatles? I didn't even realize there was a connection until I started hanging out with him, and such a nice man.
Yeah.
Totally no ego. I mean, once in a while he would just mention, for example, John came down and he was writing that song, John and Paul, Yellow Submarine. And he's like, he's playing it for me, missing some words. And if I'm hanging out with Donovan, I'll tell you, the guy is a wordsmith.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. Where did you get that from? It rhymes perfectly. It fits. Yeah. Share some stuff with me that I probably don't know, because Donovan, like I say, doesn't brag. He's just, if you know anything about that.
Yeah, I've seen him in concert. I've seen him talking about his connections with them. The most important thing, like you said before, with the claw hammer thing, was because he ends up in Rishikesh in India when the Beatles are out there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's this amazing time where, for the first time since they had their first record, they're away from the media. There's no pressure. There's no Beatlemania. There's no technology. They've just got their guitars. And as we know, they wrote, 30 whatever songs, which go onto the White Album. You got this amazingly creative moment, they're learning meditation, and all they've got are their guitars. So they're constantly writing because they've got time to do it. And Donovan's there. And because he's come from that folk background, they picked some stuff up from Dylan. But Donovan was slightly different. So it was British folk. But like you say, it's his concentration on his guitar style. And suddenly, because they've got all this time to spare,
mm-hmm.
they can sit and they can just swap ideas. And that's where he then demonstrates this style.
The people who aren't musicians, and even I didn't know about this until Donovan showed me. The claw hammer is a way of, you grab the strings around the guitar and your thumb is real key in a way with the fingers at the same time. That takes a lot of practice. And so it sounds like they had a lot of time to hang out and just spend showing each other stuff
exactly.
like that.
And learning something new. And I think that style, again, if memory serves me right, going back to the roots music of the Carter family.
That's what Donovan said, yes.
Yeah, and that's where and that's what they'd come up with this claw hammer idea. And it's hard to do.
Oh, it's very hard.
Because if you're used to doing bar chords, then to do it differently, and my thumb just doesn't want to work that way. I've tried it, and It doesn't want to bend over the top.
And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what's the Beatles song that's really famous? The claw hammer kind of was influenced or is in. What song of the Beatles is it that John does?
I think in particular it's Julia.
Julia.
Yeah, I think you can really hear that picking style, which again comes on the White Album.
Yeah,
Song for Its Mother, and it's different. You can hear that suddenly John's guitar picking, which again talking about the Beatles' roots being in country music. That's a perfect example again.
right, from Carter to Donovan to John Lennon, and then Donovan says he showed it to John, and it took 3 days for Donovan to learn it from Dirty Hugh. He says John learned it in 2, and then Paul was so good he just went off and did his own thing. He didn't even need to be shown it, and did and then he came out with Blackbird.
Yeah,
or Blackbird came out. That sounds kind of like it was influenced from.
It's that folk style, and I think it was one of the great things. Really, again, we say, are they still relevant? Is find another artist or group who has started in one style and every album has evolved and they've practiced and they've introduced different styles and they've experimented and they've always continually pushed themselves. So what you start with the first album, go all the way through, the difference in the musical genres and styles that they're playing, you cannot stick them into a pigeonhole of one in particular.
Right.
I think that again, they were always open to new technology, new style, whatever it was. They were open to learning anything new.
That's kind of like they were the first ones to do their own songs. They were one of the first bands to go to show other bands you can change genres if you want.
Yeah.
If your fans follow you and your music's good enough. So this Beatles is a wonderful band. It brings me to the thought about, okay, what happened? And there's probably also a lot of misconceptions, myths. Yoko Ono, for example, broke up the Beatles. Yeah, right. Well, what's your take on that? What's the real story behind how some bands just get tired of, it's tough being together, almost 12 hours, 24 hours a day for years at a time on tour. It's like being with your family. Brothers and sisters forever, just all the time. So what really happened? What to break up the Beatles?
I think it all starts when Brian Epstein died. So that was such a shock. He had an accidental overdose in August 1967. He was only 32.
Wow.
He'd been the manager from the start. And they'd always said they wouldn't have another manager. So with Brian gone, suddenly, what do? Now, it's like you just saying, they've been like four brothers who've been stuck with each other. Obviously, they've given up touring at the end of August 66. And they were starting to go off and do their own individual projects, but then come together to do records, whether singles or albums. But then suddenly the manager's gone. And I don't think Brian realised how important he was to what they were doing.
With the band, did they not want a manager because they had to give him 10%, or they thought they didn't need good enough?
No, they just trusted him. They trusted Brian.
Oh, then when you're so big, yeah, a lot of big celebrities. It's once they get huge and they get these bad managers who are tailcoating on them, just trying to make their money, steal their money. Things, they get taken advantage of.
Well, like Colonel Parker did with Elvis, Brian was the complete opposite. For him, he was doing everything for the benefit of the Beatles. They knew that he would look after them. So suddenly when Brian's gone, they're thinking, what the hell do we do now?
Okay.
And so the dynamic then has to change. They're starting to get relationships, getting married, starting to have kids and all that kind of stuff. So the dynamic is changing. The one who wants to keep them together is Paul. For him, the important thing is we've got to keep the Beatles together. So projects like the Magical Mystery Tour which he'd already started on with Brian. Paul was the driver behind that. And then we've had the series, the Get Back series, which Peter Jackson did, all based around the making of Let It Be, filming the Beatles in a studio, starting from scratch and creating an album.
So did the rest of the band members not want to stick together? You said Paul's the driving thing. Is the band not really cohesive? Like we're staying together?
They were starting to drift, and particularly John and Paul. And the Beatles really, they were from the start. Once they become a recording group, it's all about John and Paul. So George gets relegated straight away.
Oh yeah, someone else was telling me this other day that they felt they're like, you're going to talk to this Beatles historian, and they said something about George always felt he was not allowed to do as much original material as he wanted because Paul was dictating, no, we're going to do this, and George was kind of upset because he's a talented guy, he wants to contribute, and a lot of his ideas, the band was like, no, we're not going to play your songs.
Well, yeah,
just wanted to do his own thing.
Yeah, so George was relegated as having one, maybe two songs on an album. Because when they start in 62 and they get the record deal, George isn't songwriting yet. He doesn't start writing songs till 63. But he develops quickly to being a very, very talented songwriter. But the Beatles was still aimed at John and Paul and their songs. So George would be offered an album, a record or so.
Was that Brian's idea, or Paul and John just, it's our band, we formed it, and this is what we do?
No, it was when they got set up, because John and Paul were the songwriters, as well as signing a management contract, they signed a publishing deal on the 1st of October, 62, which was all about the song rights for the songs that John and Paul were writing.
For those of you who are not in the business,
you're lucky.
You're lucky, yeah. Oh gosh, it gets really deep in terms of legal stuff. Publishing, it reminds me of Tom Petty, who's like, I had no idea when I signed a record contract. Publishing, I thought that was like my sheet music. Publishing was all the cash, is that the money, because basically publishing means you publish your song, and now anyone that wants to play it on the radio or cover it has to pay you a royalty.
Yeah,
that's what publishing means. So if you're in the band and you sell 1 million records, it's the record sales you're cutting evenly. But that's a smaller percentage than all the worldwide royalties from being on the radio.
Yeah.
That the radio stations have to pay the publishing company for the royalty just to play your music. It doesn't quite sound right because you're thinking, well, it's the band that's making the radio, the noise on the radio. No, it's the publishers who wrote the song that make the most money. So it would make sense John and Paul want to keep their publishing because that's what Michael Jackson bought, the Beatles catalog. He was buying those publishing rights, the rights to the song. And
that's
so
where the money is.
Money's there, so they're just trying to make more money. And if we give George songs, we're not making as much. They should have done what U2 does and just put everybody's name on the song, no matter who wrote it. That's the best thing. That's the easiest thing to do. But
yeah, Coldplay did exactly the same. It said from the start, we split this 4 ways.
So John and Paul are making all the dough. So I can see why George, who is talented, he did write some good songs, is kind of getting distracted. Okay.
Yeah. So he's already relegated. So it's about John and Paul, and then the dynamic then is changing because it's always been John's group. Paul's been more of a driver, almost like the musical director from very, very early on. So the dynamic changes because they've got no manager. So Paul is the one who's trying to come up with projects and ideas. But that then changes the leadership of the group because now you've got Paul acting almost like part manager.
Yeah.
And then that's changed the relationship with John and Paul to the extent that they start drifting further and further apart. So then, people blame Yoko for the breakup. I actually think probably if it wasn't for Yoko, John would have quit a lot earlier because he was so insecure.
It reminds me of a band I was in where the guitar player suddenly thinks he's the manager.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like, again, we have no band contract. Like, who, like, I don't remember a group vote. Like, who made you the manager? But he was getting the gigs, but I was getting gigs too. That doesn't make me half manager. So, yeah, there's a lot of, when it's not on paper, who's the manager and who owns the band name and everything. There can be a
band
lot
politics.
of, band politics. So.
Yeah. So that's really, so it starts with Brian dying in August 67.
I see.
And then John and Paul start drifting apart. The dynamic changes as whose band it is.
It wasn't Yoko Ono, John's wife, who was the biggest influence on. Oh, she might have said, "Hey, John, you want to quit anyhow?" It's but that kind of thing. It wasn't as.
Yeah. Well, the thing that John changes that for them, for the four of the Beatles in the studio, it was work, and wives and girlfriends didn't come to work.
Right.
Then suddenly Yoko's in the studio with them. And that changes the band dynamic.
Well, that does lead to the idea Yoko broke the band up, though. That supports that idea.
It does. But I think because John wants to spend every possible minute with Yoko.
Yeah.
If the other three have said, no, that's not happening, John would not have gone into the studio.
He would have left anyhow.
That would have been the end of the group.
Yeah.
So they get used to that. And eventually wives and girlfriends were coming sort of in and out of the studio. But creatively, they're going down different paths. They're doing different stuff musically. They're doing things outside of the Beatles, making films, soundtracks, and stuff like that. So they're doing more and more stuff apart and then coming together to make an album. And it was just becoming more and more difficult for them to work together because it was so intense.
Yeah.
All these years, spending almost every waking hour with each other, touring the world, Beatlemania, everything they did was analysed. And I think they just reached the stage of, we need a break.
Sure. So about John Lennon, in his childhood was traumatic. His mother, if I recall right, was killed by a drunk police officer, and she got nothing out of it. And so he's quite angry at authority. And there's this idea that, that anger and sadness comes up in his songs, and that's what made him famous. And you have to have a traumatic childhood to be a famous musician, kind of. And I'm kind of like, no, you just got to write good songs. You can make up the trauma if you need to. If, say, John's mother hadn't been killed, say she was still alive when the Beatles were famous, how do you think that how might that have changed the Beatles' music, or would it have all been just still great Beatles music, or do you need that trauma and those darker songs to blend with Paul's happier songs to make the Beatles? Would it have mattered?
I don't think it would have mattered much because the big thing was that Julia encouraged him to start the Quarrymen.
Oh, his mother did before?
Yeah. She bought him his first guitar. She taught him to play it.
Cool.
She let the Quarrymen rehearse in her house. She went to the early gigs. So she was always a big encourager. Whereas Aunt Mimi, who John lived with, hated the guitar, thought it was a waste of time. So Julia was actually the encourager. So I think that would have been a massive help to John because she'd have been there supporting him all the way through. And I take what you're saying. It's the old thing of you can only sing the blues if you've lived the blues. Yeah.
Well, that's some people's theory. I say as a songwriter, and he was a good songwriter, you can make it up. I have songs people think are real stories. I'm like, you don't want to tell them I made it up because it'll ruin the song for you, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially my girlfriend. She thinks every song is about her, including the breakup ones.
Oh, that's tricky.
Yeah, right. And like, no. What do I have to do to make you understand? Well, wasn't every song about me? Well, no, I'm a songwriter.
Oh, best of luck with that one.
Yeah, right. All right, this has been great, David. Thanks.
Pleasure.
Learned a few things, and it's been a pleasure. Yes.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah. What's your next project?
I've got a couple of books on the go at the moment. One we've just finished with proofreading at the moment, which is a bit of fun, called the Beatles What If.
That one, I like that title because, I brought up 2 conspiracy theories.
Exactly.
What if?
And there are so many turning points.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
And you have all the history, all the history behind so you can follow the what if flow charts. Yeah, nice.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's fun. And so we've got just finished the documentary on the Beatles in Hamburg. So that'll be making its way to TV channels around the world soon.
Nice.
Which would be good. So,
do you play guitar?
Yeah.
What do you play?
Well, it's been one of those strange things with Beatles history, because John Lennon's first group were the Quarrymen, and I now play with the Quarrymen. So I'm playing in the band with.
This is the original Quarrymen.
Yeah.
Wow. That just brought up the question: how did he leave the Quarrymen? Get fired from the Quarrymen? How did he end up with Paul and the Beatles?
It was John's band, and the Quarrymen just become the Beatles.
Oh.
So it was always John's group. So members of the Quarrymen left. So Paul joined the Quarrymen, and then George joins the Quarrymen, and then the Quarrymen become the Beatles.
So when you say you play with the Quarrymen, how is that possible then?
So regularly, there's still Colin Hanson, the original drummer, Rod Davis, who originally played banjo, then he plays guitar now. Len Gary has been doing, he's not been well, but Len, who played THS bass back then, still sings great. I play bass guitar with them.
You guys write songs? Write your own songs? No.
We play all the stuff the Quarrymen were playing back in 56.
Oh, I see. Cool. Nice. Oh, so you probably have gigs then. You have gigs and you play. Nice.
Yeah, I tell the stories of
from
the band.
So. Awesome. That's fun.
So I play bass.
Keeps in the loop. Yeah.
So nice. I play bass, I play guitar, I play piano. Yeah.
Multi-talented. And you write books and make films.
Yeah, but apart from that.
Sounds like you're living the dream.
That is just it. I'm having so much fun.
Which is the focus of my channel. Do the thing you want to do. Live the dream. What's stopping?
Live the dream.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Thanks, David.
Absolute pleasure.
Maybe we can do this again sometime.
Give me a shout. I'll be here.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.